The administrative precedent for the 1394 expulsion was established by the catastrophic rupture of 1306, an event that fundamentally altered the legal standing of the Jewish population within the French royal domain. Under the reign of Philip the Fair, the Capetian monarchy transitioned from a model of protected servitude to one of totalizing state confiscation. On July 22, 1306, approximately 100,000 individuals were arrested in a single coordinated operation, an administrative feat that demonstrated the increasing efficiency of the royal bureaucracy. This maneuver was not prompted by ecclesiastical pressure, but by the crown's acute insolvency following protracted wars in Flanders and the devaluation of the royal currency. The legal mechanism utilized was the total revocation of residency rights, which instantly transformed all Jewish property, including real estate, household effects, and outstanding loan bonds, into the direct assets of the treasury. Royal auditors were dispatched to every bailiwick to inventory these seizures, selling physical goods at auction and aggressively pursuing the principle of Jewish debts for the king's benefit. The demographic vacuum created by this first great expulsion resulted in a localized collapse of small-scale credit markets, particularly in urban centers where Jewish financiers had provided the liquidity necessary for artisanal production and agricultural trade. By the time Louis XIII ascended the throne in 1315, the fiscal consequences of the 1306 purge had become a structural liability for the crown. The royal revenue streams previously derived from Jewish tallages and legal fees had vanished, and the Christian replacement lenders lacked the decentralized reach of the former networks. Consequently, the Edict of July 1315 was drafted not as a restoration of rights, but as a 12-year contractual lease of residency. This document explicitly referenced the committing of the Jews as a utilitarian measure to alleviate the suffering of the people who lacked access to credit. The 1315 readmission was governed by stringent financial conditions that codified the community's status as temporary residents rather than subjects. Each returning individual was required to pay an entrance fee, and the community as a whole was subjected to a recurring annual tribute. Furthermore, the edict mandated that 2/3 of all debts recovered by the returning Jews from the pre-1306 period would be forfeited directly to the royal coffers. This established the shadow of 1306 as a permanent psychological and legal framework. The returning population understood that their presence was an experimental fiscal policy subject to summary termination. The Crown's retention of the deeds to former synagogues and cemeteries, many of which had been gifted to the Church or repurposed as administrative offices, served as a physical reminder that the 1306 confiscations were irreversible. This era of return was therefore defined by a systemic instability, where the Jewish community functioned as a mobile fiscal reservoir, legally isolated from the common law and entirely dependent on the volatile requirements of a centralizing Valois state. The recall of the Jewish population in 1315 was a calculated administrative response to the failure of the Christian mercantile class to provide sufficient liquidity for the French internal economy. Louis XIV's decision to reverse the totalizing exclusion of 1306 was prompted by a series of petitions from the provincial nobility and urban burgesses, who reported a systemic paralysis in local commerce. The removal of the Jewish servants of the chamber had not only eliminated a taxable demographic, but had inadvertently dismantled the primary network of decentralized agricultural credit. Christian lenders, operating under the strictures of canon law and the scrutiny of episcopal courts, proved unable or unwilling to match the high-velocity lending patterns necessary for a kingdom increasingly reliant on cash transactions for military and judicial expenditures. The fiscal architecture of the 1315 recall was meticulously designed to ensure that the Crown remained the primary beneficiary of any restored credit activity. The edict specifically targeted the Lombards and other foreign Christian financiers, whose high interest rates and export of bullion were perceived as a greater threat to the national treasury than the presence of a religiously distinct minority. By readmitting the Jews, the monarchy sought to introduce a controlled, internal credit mechanism that would naturally lower interest rates through competition while keeping capital geographically fixed within the royal domain. This economic logic transformed the Jewish community into a specialized instrument of the state, tasked with reactivating the circulation of coin that had stagnated during the 9-year period of absence. The administrative terms of the recall were summarized in the concept of common utility. The Edict of 1315 explicitly granted the Jews a 12-year residency contract, an unusually brief duration that underscored the experimental nature of the policy. To maximize immediate royal gains, the Crown instituted a system of retroactive debt collection. Returning financiers were authorized to recover principal sums owed to them from before 1306, but the royal treasury claimed a mandatory sovereign share of these recovered assets, effectively turning the Jewish population into the king's debt collection agents against his own Christian subjects. This mechanism allowed the monarchy to bypass the political friction of direct taxation by utilizing Jewish intermediaries to extract wealth from the lower gentry and peasantry. Furthermore, the 1315 decree established a new fiscal oversight body, the Auditeur des Juifs, to monitor all contracts and ensure that the royal tallage was calculated with precision. Unlike the pre-1306 period, where Jewish status was governed by traditional custom, the 1315 recall codified their existence through a purely transactional framework. They were legally defined as foreigners, permitted to reside solely for the purpose of lending, stripped of any pretense of permanent subjecthood. This legislative shift ensured that the Jewish community remained entirely distinct from the feudal hierarchy, functioning as an isolated mobile capital pool that the Valois state could liquidate or move according to the fluctuating requirements of the royal budget. The logic of the recall was thus rooted in a pragmatic assessment of state utility, where the restoration of a minority was deemed a necessary evil to prevent the total collapse of the kingdom's financial infrastructure. The legal framework governing the 14th century return was structured around the principle of precarious tenure, effectively removing the Jewish community from the standard categories of medieval subjecthood. Unlike the Christian Third Estate, whose rights were often anchored in municipal charters or feudal custom, the Jewish population existed under a specialized juridical regime defined by the letter of privilege. This document functioned as a commercial license rather than a grant of citizenship, establishing that residency was a commodity to be purchased from the crown at fixed intervals. The 1315 readmission formalized this by demanding a substantial entry payment from every head of household, a fiscal barrier that ensured only those with significant liquid capital could cross the royal borders. This transformed the very act of presence into a taxable event, where the right to remain was perpetually contingent upon the fulfillment of evolving financial obligations. Under the Valois administration, the Jewish status was defined by the absence of droit de bourgeoisie, meaning they were excluded from the protections of city law and the governance of urban magistrates. They were legally categorized as aliens under contract, a status that prevented them from holding real estate in perpetuity or participating in the guild systems that regulated manual labor and retail trade. This restriction was strategically enforced to prevent the community from diversifying its economic base, forcing them to remain concentrated in the high-risk sector of credit and money lending. By keeping the population economically specialized and legally isolated, the Crown ensured they remained an easily identifiable and accessible fiscal target. The purchased privilege also mandated the payment of a chevage, a per capita poll tax that served as a recurring acknowledgment of their subordinate and temporary standing within the realm. The vulnerability of this conditional status was most evident in the judicial sphere, where Jewish litigants were denied access to the common courts of the Parlement. Instead, all legal matters involving the community were directed to the Gardien des Juifs, a royal official whose primary mandate was to protect the king's financial interest in Jewish assets rather than to provide objective justice. This specialized jurisdiction meant that any legal protection afforded to a Jewish individual was effectively a protection of the Crown's potential tax revenue. If a financier was defrauded by a Christian debtor, the royal intervention was prompted by the fact that such a loss diminished the financier's ability to pay the next royal tallage. This created a parasitic legal environment where the community's safety was directly proportional to its profitability. Furthermore, the temporary nature of these privileges was reinforced by the mandatory wearing of the ruelle, a circular badge of yellow felt. While often interpreted as a religious marker, in the 14th century French administrative context, it functioned as a visual indicator of legal otherness and taxability. It identified the wearer as a person existing outside the feudal pyramid and subject to the summary jurisdiction of the royal auditors. The expiration dates attached to the letters of privilege acted as a recurring sword of Damocles, allowing the monarchy to renegotiate the terms of residency and the price of protection whenever the royal budget faced a deficit. Consequently, the Jewish experience in France during this period was defined by a profound lack of structural security, as their legal existence was reduced to a series of transient, transactional agreements that could be revoked without the need for judicial review or popular consent. The fiscal operation of the French monarchy during the 14th century relied on the Jewish community as a conduit for indirect taxation, utilizing their credit activities to siphon wealth from the Christian population into the royal treasury. This sponge mechanic was facilitated by the Receveur des Juifs, an official department responsible for the systematic appropriation of capital through arbitrary levies and judicial fines. The Crown's strategy was to permit Jewish lenders to accumulate interest from local artisans, farmers, and minor nobles, groups the royal tax collectors could not easily reach, only to periodically squeeze that accumulated capital via a massive tallage. These taxes were not calculated based on profit margins, but were determined by the immediate budgetary requirements of the king, often coinciding with military expenditures or the personal debts of the royal family. To ensure the efficiency of this extraction, the Crown instituted the mandatory registration of all loan indentures in the royal archy. Every contract for debt was required to be drafted in the presence of a royal notary, who retained a counterfoil for the treasury. This bureaucratic oversight meant the king possessed a real-time inventory of the community's assets, making it impossible for financiers to conceal their liquid wealth from the tax auditors. When a community was unable to meet an assigned levy, the royal agents were empowered to seize the physical bonds themselves. These dead debts were then either collected by the Crown at their full value or sold to Christian third parties, effectively transferring the right of foreclosure from the original lender to the state. This system ensured that even the failure of a Jewish financier resulted in a net gain for the monarchy. The fiscal trap also functioned through the manipulation of interest rates and the legal definitions of usury. While the Church condemned interest as a sin, the royal administration regulated it as a taxable commodity. The Crown often mandated a maximum legal rate, but then charged the lenders a protection fee that mirrored the potential profit, ensuring that the bulk of the interest paid by the Christian populace served to subsidize the state apparatus. Furthermore, the monarchy utilized the droit de gite, an ancient right of the sovereign to demand hospitality and provisions, which was commuted into a regular cash payment specifically for the Jewish population. This transformed a feudal obligation into a perpetual drain on the community's operating capital, preventing the emergence of a self-sustaining Jewish middle class. The most aggressive form of this fiscal policy was the summary confiscation of estates upon the death of wealthy individuals. Under the principle of escheat, the Crown asserted that because the Jews were servants of the chamber, their entire legacy reverted to the king in the absence of a renewed letter of privilege. This policy incentivized the state to keep residency contracts short, as each renewal provided an opportunity to assess new entrance and exit fees. By the mid-14th century, the Jewish community had been reduced to a high-turnover financial instrument. The state tolerated the unpopularity of the lenders among the general public because it functioned as a political lightning rod. The populace's resentment over high interest rates was directed at the Jewish minority, while the ultimate financial benefit of those rates was quietly absorbed into the central royal budget. The Shepherd's Crusade of 1320, or the Second Pastoureau, represented a critical destabilization of the Jewish community's security and exposed the fundamental failure of the Capetian Valois state to honor its contractual obligations of protection. This movement originated as a populist, unauthorized mobilization of peasants and laborers from northern France, ostensibly seeking to depart for the Holy Land. However, lacking royal sanction and ecclesiastical logistical support, the disorganized masses rapidly redirected their religious zeal toward internal targets, primarily the Jewish communities of the Ile-de-France, Berry, and the Saintonge. The violence was characterized by an ideological fusion of millenarianism and economic grievance. As the shepherds viewed the elimination of non-Christian financiers as a necessary act of spiritual purification that would simultaneously annul their local debts. The administrative crisis peaked as the movement migrated toward the south, specifically affecting the regions under the jurisdiction of the Seneschal of Toulouse. The royal edict of 1315 had explicitly guaranteed Jewish residents the king's protection in exchange for their heavy taxation. Yet the local military infrastructure proved unable to contain the sheer scale of the populist insurrection. In the fortress of Verdun-sur-Garonne, several hundred Jewish refugees who had been granted temporary asylum by royal officials were ultimately forced to commit collective ritual suicide when the local garrison failed to prevent the insurgents from breaching the walls. This incident provided empirical proof that the Crown's claim to absolute authority over its servants of the chamber was structurally hollow when confronted with widespread civil disorder. The fiscal impact of the 1320 crusade was devastating for the royal treasury, as the widespread slaughter and flight of the Jewish population resulted in the destruction of the very tax base the Crown had sought to reconstruct. In many urban centers, the pastoureaux prioritized the seizure and public burning of the archive chests, an action that physically erased the documentation of royal-backed credit. This destruction of records meant the Crown could no longer audit or tax the outstanding loans, leading to a permanent loss of state revenue. Furthermore, the massacres initiated a demographic contraction, as survivors fled the royal domain for the safer, more stable jurisdictions of the Comtat Venaissin under papal administration or the Kingdom of Aragon. Philip V attempted to restore order through judicial repression, ordering local magistrates to arrest and execute thousands of the insurgents for violating the king's peace. However, the subsequent administrative response revealed the cynical nature of the royal-Jewish relationship. Instead of providing restitution for the looted property, the Crown imposed a massive collective fine on the surviving Jewish communities. The legal justification was that the community's vulnerability had necessitated an expensive military response from the state, and therefore the victims were required to reimburse the king for the cost of his unsuccessful protection. This policy of penalizing the persecuted finalized the community's transition from a privileged fiscal instrument to an existential liability. The Shepherds' Crusade thus demonstrated that while the Jewish population was legally tethered to the sovereign, the state lacked the political will and military capacity to defend that tether against the volatile religious and economic animosities of the French populace. The 1321 conspiracy theory, known as the leper plot, introduced a novel and lethal intersection between public health anxieties and state-sponsored persecution, further eroding the Jewish community's right to exist within the French royal domain. This crisis originated in the southern provinces, specifically around Périgueux and Albi, where rumors alleged that the kingdom's lepers had formed a clandestine organization to poison communal wells with a mixture of human blood, herbs, and consecrated hosts. The primary objective of this purported contamination was the total annihilation of the Christian populace. As the hysteria escalated, the narrative was expanded by local judicial officials to implicate the Jewish minority and the Muslim rulers of Granada as the true architects and financiers of the plot. This administrative framing transformed a localized panic into a national security crisis, providing a secular justification for the suspension of established legal protections. The institutionalization of the plot began with a royal ordinance issued by Philip V on June 21, 1321, which mandated the immediate arrest and interrogation of lepers throughout the realm. Under torture, many of the accused provided the coerced testimonies required by the crown, claiming that Jewish agents had distributed the poisonous powders and promised the lepers a share of the kingdom's future spoils. Unlike previous episodes of spontaneous mob violence, the 1321 persecutions were directed by the royal bailes and seneschaux, who utilized the king's authority to conduct systematic trials. In the town of Chinon, this judicial process resulted in the mass execution of an entire community, with 160 individuals burned alive in a single day. This state-directed violence demonstrated that the crown was no longer merely failing to protect its servants of the chamber, but was actively weaponizing the legal system against them. The fiscal response to the leper plot revealed the underlying economic motivations of the Valois administration. While thousands were being executed or imprisoned, the royal treasury focused on the summary sequestration of all Jewish assets. Philip V justified this total confiscation by arguing that the alleged conspiracy constituted an act of lèse-majesté or high treason, which automatically rendered the properties of the entire community forfeit to the crown. The Chambre des Comptes in Paris was tasked with managing the liquidation of these seized estates, which included urban houses, mercantile inventory, and the counterfoils of loan bonds. This massive transference of wealth was used to stabilize royal finances after the costly failure of the Flemish campaigns, proving that the monarchy could generate higher short-term revenue through total liquidation than through regular taxation. Furthermore, the 1321 crisis established the principle of collective ethnic guilt in French law. Even in regions where no leper activity was reported, Jewish families were subjected to extraordinary fines and the permanent revocation of their residency charters. The legal distinction between the servant and the traitor was effectively erased, as the crown asserted that the community's very presence was an inherent threat to the common good. This period of mass hysteria culminated in a demographic collapse. Those who escaped the stake were often driven into penury, as their means of livelihood were entirely absorbed by the state. The leper plot of 1321 thus served as a definitive judicial precedent, establishing that the royal contract of protection could be unilaterally discarded whenever a narrative of existential threat allowed for a more profitable policy of total expropriation. The expulsion of 1322, executed under the authority of Charles IV, functioned as the final legislative closure of the residency cycle initiated by the recall of 1315. This administrative removal was not a spontaneous reaction to new accusations, but a systematic enforcement of the expiration clauses embedded in the original 12-year contracts. By the early 1320s, the French crown determined that the Jewish community's fiscal utility had been exhausted by the preceding years of massacres and asset seizures. The 1322 decree was characterized by a transition from judicial persecution to a model of terminal bureaucratic exclusion, officially declaring that the presence of the Jewish servants of the chamber was no longer compatible with the public order of the realm. Unlike the broad national scope of later edicts, this removal targeted the remaining clusters of survivors in the royal domain, ensuring that the central heartlands of France were cleared of their non-Christian financial agents. The logistics of the 1322 expulsion were managed with an unprecedented focus on the total liquidation of commercial inventory. Charles IV appointed special commissioners to oversee the vacation of the Juiveries, mandating that all Jewish families depart within a window of several weeks. The Crown's primary objective was to ensure that no liquid capital exited the kingdom. To achieve this, the royal bailiffs conducted exhaustive searches of departing convoys at the frontier, sequestering silver plate, precious stones, and foreign currency. The state utilized the Châtelet in Paris as a central processing hub for the confiscated goods, where the value was extracted to settle the king's outstanding debts to Flemish and Italian contractors. This process demonstrated that the Valois state had perfected the art of exit taxation, where the very process of leaving the kingdom was turned into a final high-yield fiscal operation. The impact on the credit market was immediate and transformative. By 1322, the Crown had begun to formalize the role of the Lombards and native Christian usurers who had previously been the Jewish community's competitors. These groups were granted licenses to operate under strict royal supervision, effectively filling the commercial vacuum left by the expulsion, but operating under the standard protections of the common law. This signaled a fundamental shift in royal strategy. The monarchy moved away from a dependent, religiously isolated financial class toward a more integrated, Christian-led credit system that was less prone to triggering populist revolts. The Jewish community's specialized role as a fiscal lightning rod was thus deemed redundant in a kingdom seeking to consolidate its internal administrative stability. Furthermore, the 1322 decree mandated the permanent forfeiture of communal religious infrastructure. Synagogues that had not been destroyed during the leper plot were now legally classified as crown property and systematically auctioned or gifted to local parishes. The transition of these buildings into churches or municipal storehouses physically manifested the totalizing nature of the exclusion. By the end of 1322, the organized Jewish presence in the royal domain had effectively ceased to exist, and the legal category of Jewish residency was removed from the royal registers for over 30 years. This period of absence established a new baseline for French demographic policy, that the return of the Jewish population would only be considered in moments of ultimate national emergency, such as the total fiscal collapse that would follow the start of the 100 Years' War. The administrative decision to readmit the Jewish population in 1359 was the direct result of the totalizing fiscal collapse triggered by the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. Following the decisive English victory and the capture of King John II, the French state faced a crisis of sovereignty and a paralyzed treasury. The Treaty of Bretigny imposed a staggering ransom of 3 million gold écus for the release of the monarch, an amount that exceeded the total annual revenue of the royal domain. The Dauphin Charles, acting as regent amidst the chaos of the Jacquerie and the Parisian uprisings, led by Etienne Marcel, found himself unable to extract sufficient coinage from the traditional Estates General. The French peasantry was exhausted by plague and war, and the professional merchant classes were unwilling to grant the necessary credit to a government perceived as militarily incompetent. In this environment of ultimate emergency, the monarchy turned to the Jewish community as the only demographic capable of providing immediate, high-velocity liquid capital. The Ordinance of March 1st, 1359, issued by the Dauphin, established a new 20-year charter for Jewish residency, a duration nearly double that of the 1315 experiment. This extension was a strategic concession intended to attract the wealthiest financiers from the surrounding independent territories of Provence, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Comtat Venaissin, who required long-term security before reinvesting their capital in the volatile French economy. The fiscal terms of this recall were unprecedented in their precision. Each head of a household was required to pay an entrance fee of 14 florins, with an additional florin for each family member or servant. Beyond this initial payment, the community was subjected to a recurring annual protection tax of 7 florins per household. These funds were funneled into a specialized account dedicated almost exclusively to the king's ransom, effectively making the Jewish community the primary underwriters of John II's freedom. To ensure the profitability of this return and the community's ability to meet these heavy royal levies, the 1359 decree authorized an interest rate of 4 deniers per pound per week, roughly equivalent to 86% annually. This exceptionally high rate was a deliberate state policy designed to stimulate the rapid accumulation of capital that could then be squeezed by the royal auditors. The administrative framework of this return was managed by a newly created office, the Procureur Général des Juifs, which bypassed the traditional bailiwicks to ensure direct monarchical control over Jewish assets. This department provided the community with extensive judicial autonomy, granting them the right to adjudicate internal matters according to rabbinic law, and protecting them from the interventions of the Church's inquisitorial courts regarding secular business. This temporary legal immunity was a necessary pragmatic compromise to ensure the efficiency of the credit network during the kingdom's reconstruction. The 1359 readmission thus represented the final phase of the Valois instrumentalization policy, where the Jewish population was utilized as a surgical financial tool to stabilize a monarchy on the verge of total institutional disintegration. The biological catastrophe of the mid-14th century pandemic and its subsequent recurring waves established an ideological residue that fundamentally compromised the success of the 1359 readmission. While the first Great Plague of 1348 had decimated the European population during a period of Jewish absence from the French royal domain, the memory of that trauma served as the foundational narrative for the returnees. The well-poisoning myth, which had been a localized judicial tool during the 1321 leper plot, was transformed into a universalized cultural axiom following the 1348 pandemic. This epidemiological radicalization of the Christian populace meant that the Jewish financiers who returned to Paris and the northern provinces to fund the ransom of John the Good entered a society that viewed their physical presence as an inherent threat to public health. The administrative tension peaked during the second major outbreak of the plague, the Pestis Secunda of 1360-1363, which coincided precisely with the first years of the new 20-year residency charter. Unlike the previous Valois policy of utilizing the Jewish minority as a mobile fiscal reservoir, the post-plague state was forced to manage a population increasingly prone to spontaneous, religiously motivated riots. The royal administration, recognizing that the destruction of Jewish communities would jeopardize the ongoing installments of the king's ransom, was compelled to institute a policy of extreme social quarantine. This period saw the formalization of the Juveries into rigid, gated enclaves where the Jewish population was legally restricted from interacting with Christian domestic servants and prohibited from public appearance during Christian liturgical feasts. This segregation was a defensive maneuver by the state to prevent populist violence, but it had the unintended consequence of crippling the very commercial networks the readmission was intended to foster. The judicial handling of well-poisoning accusations during the 1360s demonstrated a shift from royal-led persecution toward a model of localized, inquisitorial vigilance. Although the Crown officially rejected the poisoning narrative to protect its tax base, the lower judiciary and municipal councils often acted independently to enforce discriminatory sanitary ordinances. These regulations restricted Jewish access to public markets and communal water sources, effectively legalizing the social isolation that had previously been a byproduct of mob hysteria. This institutionalized distance prevented the Jewish community from fulfilling its role as a high-velocity credit provider, as the physical barriers of the ghettoized enclaves increased the transactional costs of lending and restricted the movement of Jewish mercantile agents between provincial fairs. Furthermore, the Black Death initiated a profound demographic contraction within the Jewish community itself. The loss of skilled rabbinic leadership and specialized financiers to the disease led to a fragmentation of communal governance. This internal weakness made the community even more dependent on the protection of the king's procureurs, who utilized the crisis to demand mortuary taxes and succession fees for estates left vacant by plague victims. The economic impact was a permanent drain on the operating capital of the Kahilot, ensuring they remained in a state of perpetual financial fragility. The legacy of the Black Death thus ensured that the 14th century return was characterized by a systemic social friction. The Jewish community was trapped between a monarchy that demanded their gold to pay for a lost war and a populace that viewed their very survival as a catalyst for divine punishment and biological decay. The professionalization of the Jewish royal interface reached its administrative zenith following the 1359 readmission through the institutionalization of the Procureur et Commissaire Général des Juifs. This specialized office was personified by Manessier de Vesoul, a high-level financier who served as the indispensable diplomatic conduit between the Valois court and the dispersed Jewish enclaves. Unlike the informal community elders of the previous century, Manessier functioned as a bureaucratically recognized agent of the monarchy, granted a royal commission that empowered him to negotiate the specific terms of the residency charters directly with the King's Council. His appointment by John II and subsequent confirmation by Charles V signaled a transition toward a more centralized and predictable model of minority management, where the Jewish community was governed not merely by traditional decree, but through a bilateral, albeit asymmetrical, diplomatic channel. Manessier's primary administrative mandate involved the coordination of the massive fiscal levies required for the royal treasury. He was responsible for the apportionment of the annual tallage across the various kehilot, ensuring that the internal collection processes within the synagogues met the rigid deadlines imposed by the Chambre des Comptes. To facilitate this, the Crown granted him quasi-judicial authority over his coreligionists, including the power to impose fines, order arrests, and excommunicate individuals who obstructed the fiscal goals of the state. This delegation of power created a unique internal hierarchy where the Procurator General acted as both a communal advocate and a royal disciplinarian. His role was essential for the Crown because it provided a single point of accountability for the Jewish tax base, bypassing the slow and often corrupt mechanisms of the local provincial bailiffs. In the sphere of high diplomacy, Manessier de Vesoul utilized his direct access to the sovereign to intercede in cases of local judicial overreach or populist agitation. He acted as the voice of the chamber, presenting formal grievances to the king regarding the violation of Jewish safe conducts or the illegal seizure of assets by municipal authorities. During the residency extensions of 1360 and 1374, Manessier was the principal negotiator for the community, successfully lobbying for the maintenance of high interest rates and the preservation of internal judicial autonomy. These negotiations were conducted in the Parlement and the Royal Cabinet, elevating Jewish representation to a level of professional statecraft that had no parallel in the other European monarchies of the period. The existence of this diplomatic class, which included other prominent figures like Denis Michaud before his conversion, underscored the utter reliance of the Jewish community on the personal favor of the Valois kings. While Manessier was able to secure temporary stays of execution for debts and occasional exemptions from discriminatory ordinances, his influence was entirely derivative of royal utility. The office of the Procurator General effectively turned Jewish leadership into a specialized department of the French financial administration. This high-level engagement provided a veneer of institutional stability, yet it simultaneously reinforced the community's isolation from the broader French legal system. By the end of Charles V's reign, the Jewish population was no longer a collection of servants in the traditional sense, but a professionally managed, state-contracted financial collective whose survival depended on the continued efficacy of its diplomatic agents within the royal court. The privilege of 1360, codified as a formal royal ordinance, represented the most comprehensive legislative attempt to integrate Jewish financial operations into the permanent architecture of the French state. This charter was not merely a residency permit, but a detailed contractual agreement between the monarchy and the newly reformed Kehilot, designed to replace the ad hoc arrangements of the 1359 return with a standardized legal framework. The 20-year duration specified in the document was an unprecedented administrative commitment intended to provide the security necessary for financiers to repatriate capital that had been sheltered in independent principalities for decades. This period of guaranteed tenure was a calculated fiscal maneuver by the regency of the Dauphin Charles, to ensure that the primary underwriters of the royal debt remained within the jurisdiction of the Trésor long enough to fulfill the heavy installments of the king's ransom following the Treaty of Bretigny. A central pillar of the 1360 privilege was the formal exemption of the Jewish community from the droit de marque, or the right of reprisal. In medieval French law, this custom allowed for the seizure of any individual's property to satisfy a debt owed by a member of the same community or city. By legally insulating Jewish lenders from this collective liability, the Crown protected its fiscal agents from the chaotic litigation of Christian merchants. This created a legal island where Jewish capital could move with greater fluidity than native Christian commerce. Furthermore, the charter granted the community the privilege of the seal, allowing Jewish lenders to utilize a specifically designated royal stamp to authenticate their own contracts. This bureaucratic elevation meant that a Jewish debt bond carried the same evidentiary weight in a royal court as a document issued by a high-ranking Christian notary, a provision that significantly reduced the time and cost of judicial foreclosure. The 1360 ordinance also addressed the physical requirements of the credit network by authorizing the purchase of residential property. While previous edicts restricted the community to leased dwellings, the new privilege permitted Jewish families to acquire houses for their own use, provided these structures were not used as collateral for Christian loans. This was an administrative strategy to anchor the wealthiest financiers to the urban centers of Paris and Rouen, preventing them from liquidating their assets and fleeing during periods of political instability. To further encourage this sedentary capital, the Crown granted an exemption from all municipal tolls and internal customs duties, allowing Jewish mercantile agents to transport specie and goods across provincial borders without the extractive interference of the local nobility. Crucially, the 1360 privilege established that the Jewish community was subject to the summary jurisdiction of the Justices of the Jews, a specialized body that bypassed the traditional Parlement. This judicial autonomy ensured that any challenge to the Charter was handled by royal appointees whose primary objective was the maintenance of state revenue. The Charter effectively transformed the Jewish population into a state-managed guild of financiers, governed by a unique set of statutes that prioritized fiscal efficiency over canon law restrictions. By the time of its promulgation, the 1360 privilege had successfully converted the Jewish presence into a permanent, highly regulated department of the Valois fiscal machine, providing the monarchy with a predictable revenue stream that would sustain the reconstruction of the kingdom for the next 2 decades. The reign of Charles V, often designated as the Sage, marked a unique and temporary divergence in Valois policy, where the Jewish presence was valued not merely for its liquid capital, but for its command of specialized scientific and linguistic knowledge. This intellectual intersection was a critical component of the king's program to centralize cultural authority through the translation of authoritative texts into the French vernacular. While the University of Paris remained a bastion of orthodox scholasticism and ecclesiastical exclusion, the royal court at the Louvre functioned as a more pragmatic center for the acquisition of technical data, particularly in the fields of astronomy, medicine, and cartography. To facilitate this, the monarchy utilized Jewish scholars as essential intermediaries who possessed the linguistic keys to the superior scientific corpus of the Arabic and Hebrew traditions, which remained largely inaccessible to the Latin-educated Christian clergy. The primary manifestation of this scholarly engagement was the translation project involving the Almagest and other foundational astronomical works. Charles V's library, which served as the institutional nucleus of the nascent state, contained several Hebrew manuscripts specifically acquired to refine the royal astronomical tables. These tables were essential for the kingdom's maritime navigation and the standardization of the liturgical calendar, tasks that required mathematical precision beyond the capacity of traditional monastic education. Jewish polyglots, often drawn from the sophisticated academies of Languedoc and Provence, were commissioned to render these texts into French. This process was not merely a linguistic exercise, but a technical transfer of knowledge. The translators provided original commentaries and updated observational data, incorporating the use of the astrolabe and advanced trigonometric functions that had been preserved in the Mediterranean Kehilot. In the medical sphere, the Valois court maintained a consistent, albeit clandestine, reliance on Jewish physicians, effectively bypassing the restrictive decrees of the Faculty of Medicine. These practitioners were prized for their access to the pharmacopoeia and clinical observations of the Islamic world, which prioritized empirical evidence over the superstitious practices prevalent in contemporary Northern European medicine. Their training, rooted in the Greco-Arabic synthesis, provided the monarchy with a level of healthcare that served as a marker of courtly prestige. This technical dependency created a specialized intellectual safe conduct for a small elite of Jewish savants, whose residency was protected by their status as indispensable technical advisors rather than as simple credit providers. Furthermore, this intellectual exchange influenced the royal administration's approach to timekeeping and state logistics. The translation of Hebrew calendrical systems allowed the royal secretaries to harmonize the diverse regional dating methods used across the fragmented French provinces, a prerequisite for the effective coordination of the tax collection cycles and military mobilizations. This scholarly utility acted as a stabilizing force for the Jewish community during the 1370s, as it provided a secular, non-fiscal justification for the maintenance of their residency charters. However, this period of intellectual cooperation remained structurally fragile. It was an idiosyncratic feature of Charles V's personal governing style rather than a permanent institutional shift. The scientific transfer was strictly unidirectional, serving the king's objective of intellectual sovereignty. As the Valois state-building project became increasingly aligned with ecclesiastical goals under Charles V's successors, this brief scholarly bridge would be dismantled, leaving the Jewish community once again defined solely by its precarious financial utility. The enforcement of the Servi Camera Regis status under Charles V shifted from a theoretical legal classification to a rigorous program of physical and jurisdictional insulation. During the 1370s, the French crown utilized this designation to override the emerging power of the urban guilds and the municipal authorities of Paris, who sought to impose their own restrictive ordinances on the resident Jewish financiers. The central administrative tool for this protection was the Sauvegarde du Roi, a specific royal letter of safeguard that placed a Jewish household under the immediate protection of the king's officers. These letters were not merely symbolic. They legally prohibited any municipal sergeant or guild official from entering a Jewish dwelling to seize property or serve summons without the explicit presence of a royal bailiff. This created a dual legal system within the city walls, where the Jewish quarter operated as a sovereign sanctuary, immune to the evolving regulations of the Hôtel de Ville. The primary enforcer of this royal prerogative was Hugues Aubriot, the Prévôt de Paris, who acted as the king's direct representative in the capital. Aubriot's administration was characterized by a systematic defense of Jewish residency rights against the encroachment of the Parisian bourgeoisie. Under his direction, the royal police at the Châtelet were utilized to suppress anti-Jewish demonstrations orchestrated by the craft guilds, who viewed Jewish credit activities as a direct circumvention of their monopolistic control over local trade. Aubriot famously authorized the construction of new gates and defensive barriers around the Juiveries, effectively turning the Jewish enclaves into fortified royal outposts within the city. This physical infrastructure was essential for the crown to ensure the safety of its fiscal agents, as it prevented spontaneous mob violence from disrupting the collection of the royal tallages. The friction between royal protection and guild hostility was most acute in the sphere of labor and retail competition. The urban maîtrises, or master guilds, argued that Jewish commercial activities violated their exclusive rights to manufacture and sell specific goods. In response, Charles V issued a series of decrees that clarified the non-common status of Jewish subjects. The monarchy asserted that because the Jews were the personal property of the king's chamber, they were not bound by the statutes of the Christian guilds. This allowed Jewish financiers to engage in the trade of second-hand goods and precious metals, activities that were often collateral for loans, without being subject to guild inspections or fees. This judicial shielding was a deliberate strategy to maximize the liquidity of Jewish assets, ensuring that capital could be liquidated and taxed by the crown without interference from the municipal corporations. However, the rigidity of this royal protection carried a high political cost. By placing the Jewish community outside the reach of local law, the monarchy inadvertently transformed the financiers into symbols of royal tyranny in the eyes of the urban populace. The Prévôt Hugues Aubriot became a target of ecclesiastical and municipal resentment, eventually facing accusations of heresy and Judaizing for his unwavering defense of the king's Jewish subjects. The enforcement of the servi camera status thus created a dangerous paradox. While it successfully preserved the community's economic utility during the reign of Charles V, it fundamentally alienated them from the social fabric of the cities. The Jewish population remained secure only so long as the royal administration possessed the military and judicial strength to suppress the frustrations of the guilds. When the central authority weakened at the end of the 14th century, this very insulation would become the primary justification for the populist uprisings that demanded the total removal of the king's protected financiers. Under the administration of Charles V, Jewish capital transitioned from a tool of general debt repayment to a specific engine for the military and defensive modernization of the French state. The protracted conflict of the Hundred Years' War necessitated a departure from the traditional feudal levy, which had proven inefficient and tactically obsolete at the start of the century. To sustain a permanent military presence and counter the threat of the Grandes Compagnies, unemployed mercenary bands ravaging the countryside, the monarchy required massive and predictable flows of liquid currency. This shift toward a professionalized army was fundamentally underpinned by the extraordinary tallages levied upon the Jewish communities of the northern provinces. These funds were directed into the Trésor de l'Extraordinaire de Guerre, a specialized department that bypassed the rigidities of the traditional treasury to provide immediate payment for contracted men-at-arms. The most visible manifestation of this fiscal military nexus was the total reconstruction of Paris's fortifications. Following the urban revolts of the mid-14th century, the Crown sought to create a defensive perimeter that served both as a barrier against external English incursions and as an instrument of internal royal control. The construction of the Enceinte de Charles Fanm, an expansive new wall on the right bank, was largely financed through the interest-derived taxes and residency fees paid by the residents of the Juveries. This project involved the excavation of massive ditches and the erection of reinforced masonry curtains that doubled the city's fortified area. Central to this defensive scheme was the Bastille Saint-Antoine, a formidable stone fortress designed to guard the royal residence at the Hôtel Saint-Paul. The liquidity provided by Jewish financiers allowed the Crown to pay thousands of laborers, stonecutters, and master masons in silver coinage, ensuring the rapid completion of these strategic works without the delays associated with baronial contributions. The professionalization of the royal army under the Constable Bertrand du Guesclin also relied on Jewish capital to facilitate the transition to a paid standing force. The monarchy utilized Jewish credit to fund the indemnité de guerre, the payments required to buy off mercenary captains or to secure the service of specialized foreign units, such as Genoese crossbowmen. By utilizing Jewish intermediaries to manage the circulation of currency, the monarchy could maintain a continuous military presence in the field even during periods of agricultural depression. This monetization of warfare allowed Charles V to pursue a strategy of attrition, avoiding catastrophic pitched battles while systematically regaining lost territories. The Jewish community's specialized role as a royal bank for the military apparatus meant that every piece of ordnance used in the Guerre du Roi was effectively a product of the interest rates permitted by the royal charter. However, this indispensable role in the kingdom's defense created a dangerous sociological friction. While the Jewish financiers were essential for the security of the state, their activity was directly linked in the public mind to the heavy tax burden required to sustain the war. The fortifications of Paris, while providing safety, were perceived by the overtaxed burgesses as physical monuments to the usurious capital that drained the wealth of the common people. By the 1380s, the economic engine that had rebuilt the defenses of France had become its most controversial political asset, as the populace increasingly viewed the Jewish financiers as the primary beneficiaries of a permanent state of war. The death of Charles V on September 16, 1380, fundamentally terminated the era of centralized administrative protection and inaugurated a period of political fragmentation that proved lethal to the Jewish community's legal standing. The succession of the 11-year-old Charles VI necessitated the establishment of a regency dominated by the uncles of the king, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy, and Bourbon. This transition marked a decisive shift from a monarchy that utilized Jewish financiers as a strategic state asset to an aristocratic regime that viewed them as a source of immediate private plunder. The institutional cohesion of the Valois state, which had previously prioritized the long-term solvency of its fiscal agents, dissolved into a series of competing dynastic interests as each duke sought to liquidate royal resources to fund their personal territorial ambitions. The first manifestation of this instability was the immediate fiscal vacuum created by the dying king's 11th-hour abolition of the fouages, or hearth taxes. This deathbed decree, intended to ease the king's spiritual transition, deprived the new regency of its primary source of legitimate revenue. Faced with an empty treasury and the ongoing costs of the war with England, the uncles bypassed the traditional Chambre des Comptes and looked toward the Jewish community to fill the deficit. However, unlike the Sage administration, which had regulated its extractions through formal tallages and residency contracts, the Regency adopted a model of spontaneous and localized expropriation. The Duke of Anjou, in particular, utilized his position as regent to demand emergency loans that were essentially uncompensated seizures of liquid capital, bypassing the formal protections guaranteed in the 1360 and 1374 charters. The removal of the sovereign protector also facilitated a resurgence of ecclesiastical influence over the royal council. The uncles, seeking to secure their own legitimacy and the support of the high clergy, began to withdraw the judicial shielding that Charles X had provided against the Inquisition. This erosion of protection was personified in the fall of Hugues Aubriot, the Prévôt de Paris. Aubriot, the primary enforcer of the king's Jewish safe-conducts, was arrested by the Bishop of Paris shortly after the king's death on charges of heresy and Judaizing. His imprisonment removed the physical and administrative barrier that had kept the municipal and clerical authorities from the Juiveries. Without Aubriot's royal police to intervene, the jurisdictional immunity of the Jewish quarter was effectively terminated, leaving the residents subject once more to the summary justice of the episcopal courts. Furthermore, the uncles' mismanagement of the royal currency and their failure to regulate the urban guilds empowered the rising bourgeoisie of Paris and Rouen. These merchant classes, who had long chafed under the competition of royal-backed Jewish financiers, recognized that the Regency lacked the political will to suppress anti-Jewish agitation. The transition of 1380 thus transformed the Jewish community from servants of the chamber into political pawns. By the winter of that year, the institutional barriers that had insulated the financiers from the frustrations of the overtaxed populace were dismantled. The death of Charles V had not only removed a monarch, but had also destroyed the specialized legal framework that allowed a non-Christian minority to survive within a host society increasingly defined by religious militancy and aristocratic greed. The November 1380 riots in Paris served as the primary violent manifestation of the fiscal crisis, triggered by the transition from the centralized administration of Charles V to the regency of the uncles. On November 12th, as the urban populace of Paris reacted to the contradictory royal decrees regarding tax abolition, a spontaneous insurrection bypassed royal garrisons to target the Juiveries situated on the streets of Saint-Bon and Saint-Denis. This mobilization was not merely a spontaneous burst of religious animosity, but a calculated assault on the physical infrastructure of royal credit. The mob, comprised largely of overtaxed artisans and petty merchants, recognized that the Jewish quarter functioned as the primary archive of their own financial obligations. The violence was specifically directed at the destruction of the arche, the triple-locked chests containing the debt bonds and counterfoils that legally tethered the Christian populace to the royal treasury. The administrative impact of this record destruction was catastrophic for the Chambre des Comptes. By incinerating the parchments, the rioters effectively unilaterally annulled thousands of pounds in outstanding interest and principal, depriving the regency of the liquid assets required to manage the kingdom's defense. This was a clean slate revolt where the physical elimination of the creditor and the legal instrument was the primary objective. During the 3 days of unrest, the royal authorities at the Bastille and the Louvre remained largely passive, reflecting the Regency's lack of cohesive command following the arrest of Hugues Aubriot. Without the intervention of the Prévost's police, the mob was permitted to loot the collateral pledges, jewelry, fine textiles, and precious metals that had been deposited with Jewish lenders as security for loans. This theft represented a massive, uncompensated transfer of wealth from the king's chamber servants to the lower strata of the Parisian bourgeoisie. Furthermore, the 1380 riots introduced a systematic reliance on forced baptism as a tool of survival. Faced with the ultimatum of the stake or the font, several Jewish families chose nominal conversion to protect their lives, creating a new demographic of conversos whose legal status remained ambiguous under the Regency. Unlike the state-sanctioned trials of 1321, the violence of 1380 was characterized by a total breakdown of the judicial apparatus. The Regency, desperate to regain the support of the Parisian municipal leaders, initially refused to prosecute the rioters, essentially condoning the liquidation of Jewish assets to appease the overtaxed populace. The social consequence of this inaction was the permanent erosion of the royal sanctuary concept. The Jewish community realized that the privilege of 1360 was unenforceable without a monarch willing to deploy military force against his own capital. When the government finally attempted to restore order, it did so not by returning the looted property, but by issuing a general amnesty for the rioters in exchange for a new communal tax. This finalized the transformation of the Jewish population into an unprotected fiscal buffer. They were expected to provide the capital for the state while serving as a sacrificial outlet for the kingdom's growing anti-fiscal sentiment. The 1380 riots thus established the blueprint for the terminal decade of Jewish life in France, where the destruction of documentation became the ultimate weapon of the indebted majority against a fracturing monarchy. The Maillotin Revolt of March 1382 represented a sophisticated escalation of anti-fiscal resistance, where the urban proletariat transitioned from spontaneous rioting to organized paramilitary action against the Valois state's financial apparatus. The immediate catalyst was the reintroduction of the aids, onerous indirect taxes on essential commodities, which the Regency of the Uncles sought to impose after the exhaustion of the 1380 emergency hearth tax levies. The rebellion was triggered at the Hallmarket in Paris, when a royal tax collector attempted to seize a fee from a watercress vendor, an event that served as the signal for a pre-coordinated uprising of the Menu Peuple. Unlike the previous disturbances that prioritized symbolic destruction, the 1382 insurgents systematically armed themselves by seizing thousands of lead mallets from the city's municipal arsenal at the Hôtel de Ville, earning the designation maillotin. This armament allowed the rebels to overwhelm the local royal garrisons and establish a temporary commune that prioritized the physical elimination of everyone associated with the ferme des aides, or the tax farming system. The Jewish community was central to this insurrection because the maillotins viewed them as the foundational layer of the kingdom's oppressive fiscal machinery. While the 1380 riots had primarily targeted the archives of debt, the 1382 revolt identified the lenders as the active living proxies of the royal treasury. The insurgents argued that the aids were only necessary because the monarchy was perpetually indebted to Jewish financiers. Thus, the removal of the creditor was perceived as a mandatory prerequisite for the permanent abolition of the sales tax. During the height of the March violence, Jewish dwellings were invaded to dismantle the private residences of the king's financial agents. The total collapse of the Prévôt's authority meant that the royal protection was once again suspended as the Regency retreated to the safety of the fortress at Vincennes, effectively abandoning the Juiverie to the summary justice of the lead mallet-wielding crowds. This anti-fiscal contagion was not confined to Paris, but synchronized with similar uprisings in the provincial capitals, most notably the Harel in Rouen and the revolts in Reims and Orléans. In Rouen, the rebels utilized the same ideological framework, attacking the royal tax offices and the Jewish quarters simultaneously to signal a total rejection of the Valois fiscal state. These coordinated strikes demonstrated a growing political awareness among the urban guilds that the king's servants of the chamber and the royal tax farmers were two components of a single extractive system. The Maillotin revolt forced the Regency into a humiliating negotiation, where the uncles were compelled to temporarily suspend the aids in exchange for the restoration of urban order. This concession provided a dangerous precedent, as it proved that organized violence against the king's financial agents could force a retreat in royal fiscal policy. The administrative aftermath of 1382 saw a hardening of the royal council's stance against the Jewish minority. While Charles VI's eventual military return in 1383 brought severe repression against the Maillotins, the monarchy's trust in the Jewish community as a stable fiscal instrument was permanently compromised. The state realized that the cost of defending the Servi Camera against a militarized populace was becoming prohibitively high. The Jewish population, facing a Christian majority that had learned to weaponize the lead mallet against the tax collector, began liquidating their own holdings in anticipation of further instability. The 1382 revolt thus marked the point where the French state-building project and the Jewish financial network began to decouple. As the monarchy looked for less volatile methods of taxation, that would not invite the total collapse of urban authority. The definitive collapse of the Jewish community's security was precipitated by the executive paralysis that followed the first manifest episode of Charles VI's mental illness in August 1392. During a military expedition in the forest of Le Mans, the king's sudden violent delirium resulted in the immediate suspension of his personal rule, an event that effectively terminated the influence of the marmousets, the professional, low-ranking royal counselors who had prioritized fiscal pragmatism over ideological militancy. The onset of the king's madness transformed the French monarchy from a centralized administrative state into a fractured arena of factional competition, primarily between the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, and the king's brother, Louis of Orleans. In this jurisdictional vacuum, the Jewish population lost its singular point of legal anchorage, as the royal protection was no longer a matter of consistent policy, but a variable dependent on the shifting dominance of rival princely houses. The political instability coincided with the peak of the Great Western Schism, a period where the French crown was forced to navigate the competing claims of the rival popes in Rome and Avignon. To secure their own legitimacy as regents, the dukes competed for the favor of the University of Paris and the high ecclesiastical hierarchy, both of whom advocated for the total religious purification of the realm as a remedy for the kingdom's divine abandonment. Philip the Bold, seeking to distinguish his administration from the perceived fiscal tyranny of Charles V, aligned himself with the anti-Jewish theologians who argued that the continued presence of non-Christian financiers was a spiritual contaminant that prolonged the king's infirmity. The administrative logic shifted. The servants of the chamber were no longer viewed as necessary financial lubricants, but as obstacles to the moral restoration required to heal the sovereign. This period of regency was characterized by the systematic removal of the legal barriers that had previously separated the Jewish quarter from the inquisitorial courts. The royal council, lacking a rational monarch to sign protective warrants, permitted the ecclesiastical authorities to reassert their jurisdiction over Jewish converts and their families. This erosion of immunity was a strategic concession to the Church, allowing the dukes to trade Jewish security for clerical support in their dynastic struggles. The Jewish community's fiscal utility was simultaneously diminishing, as the Valois administration had successfully institutionalized the gabelle and other permanent taxes, which provided a more stable revenue stream than the volatile tallages of the juveries. The professionalization of the royal tax farmers, or fermiers, rendered the specialized Jewish financiers administratively redundant. Furthermore, the factional struggle for control of the royal treasury led to a series of contradictory decrees that made long-term financial planning impossible for the Kehillat. While the Duke of Orleans occasionally attempted to uphold the residency charters to maintain a source of personal credit, the Burgundian faction utilized its control over the Paris municipal government to enforce new discriminatory regulations. This legislative incoherence created a juridical vacuum where the Jewish population was neither fully protected nor officially expelled, existing in a state of terminal precarity. The madness of Charles VI thus achieved a result that populist riots had failed to accomplish. It decapitated the royal administration of its rationalist fiscal core, leaving the Jewish community exposed to an aristocratic regime that prioritized religious uniformity and the favor of the Church over the traditional pragmatic alliances of the Capetian state. Isabeau of Bavaria's emergence as the presiding figure of the Grand Conseil during Charles II's frequent periods of delirium created a courtly environment that was highly susceptible to the influence of radical theologians and the high clergy. Following the king's initial collapse, the Queen's court at the Hôtel Saint-Paul became the primary center of executive decision-making, where the influence of the marmousets, the professional legists who had prioritized secular fiscal stability, was replaced by a circle of advisors who viewed the kingdom's recovery through the lens of spiritual purification. This ecclesiastical lobby, led by university doctors from the Sorbonne, such as Jean Gerson, posited that the king's madness was a divine sanction for the continued tolerance of non-believers within the royal domain. This theological framework shifted the state's orientation. The Jewish presence was no longer analyzed as a fiscal mechanism, but was conceptualized as a spiritual obstacle to the restoration of the king's health and the resolution of the Great Schism. The Queen's administration began to prioritize the concept of unitas Christiana, or Christian unity, as a prerequisite for national and dynastic stability. Under the influence of her confessors, the Grand Conseil began a systematic dismantling of the administrative protections that had historically insulated the Jewish community from episcopal interference. The theological advisors argued that the Jewish community's specialized legal status, which granted them immunity from parish tithes and allowed them to adjudicate internal matters via rabbinic law, represented an unacceptable dilution of the king's Christian sovereignty. Consequently, the residency charters were increasingly scrutinized not for their financial yield, but for their impact on the moral character of the kingdom. This isolation meant that the community's leaders lost their traditional diplomatic access to the sovereign, as the Queen's court implemented a policy of piety through exclusion. To facilitate this shift toward religious uniformity, Isabeau's council began to enforce existing discriminatory statutes with unprecedented bureaucratic rigor. The ordinances of 1393 and 1394 mandated a stricter physical segregation of the Juveries, prohibiting the employment of Christian domestic servants in Jewish households, and restricting the movement of Jewish mercantile agents during religious festivals. These regulations were designed to emphasize the pariah status of the minority and to satisfy the demands of the urban clergy who viewed Jewish social integration as a catalyst for heresy. By increasing the social and legal costs of residency, the Queen's advisors effectively prepared the political ground for a definitive expulsion, framing the removal as an act of state-sponsored devotion that would appease the divine and restore order to the fracturing Valois monarchy. Furthermore, the professionalization of the royal tax system had progressed to the point where the crown no longer required the specialized services of Jewish financiers to manage the circulation of currency. The institutionalization of the gabelle and the aids provided the Grand Conseil with a more sustainable revenue stream through Christian tax farmers, or fermiers, who were more politically palatable than the usurers of the chamber. The Queen's advisors successfully lobbying for the revocation of specific Jewish tax exemptions, further draining the community's capital reserves. By late 1394, the influence of Isabeau of Bavaria had successfully transformed the Jewish question from a matter of fiscal utility into a mandatory act of religious purification, ensuring that the final decree of expulsion was presented as a moral necessity for the survival of the French realm. In 1392, the administrative and theological tensions surrounding the Jewish presence in France were crystallized in the judicial proceedings known as the Denis Michaud affair. Michaud, a prominent financier who had previously undergone baptism to enter the Valois administration, was accused alongside 7 other recent converts of abandoning the Christian faith to return to Judaism. Under canon law, the act of a baptized individual reverting to their former religion was classified as relapse, a capital form of apostasy that fell under the direct jurisdiction of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. This case provided the ecclesiastical lobby at the court of Isabeau of Bavaria with a specific, high-profile example of the spiritual contagion they claimed was inherent in the continued proximity of Jewish and Christian populations. The judicial handling of the case exposed the terminal erosion of royal jurisdictional immunity. Previously, the Prévôt de Paris would have claimed jurisdiction over any secular matters involving the king's Jewish subjects. However, because the affair involved the sacrament of baptism, the Bishop of Paris and the inquisitors asserted a superior authority that the Regency was unwilling to contest. In May 1392, 7 prominent members of the Parisian Kahila were arrested and brought before the Parlement of Paris, charged not with financial crimes, but with the crime of seducing converts back to their original faith. The prosecution argued that the very existence of an organized Jewish community provided the logistical and social support necessary for apostasy to occur, thereby making the entire community an accessory to a spiritual felony. The resulting sentences were unprecedented in their severity and functioned as a formal prelude to the 1394 expulsion. On the orders of the Parlement, the 7 Jewish defendants were sentenced to be publicly whipped at the major crossroads of Paris on 3 successive Saturdays before being condemned to perpetual banishment and the total confiscation of their property. This sentence effectively criminalized the act of religious persistence. The Machault affair allowed the University of Paris and the royal confessors to frame the Jewish community as an active 5th column that undermined the spiritual integrity of the French state. They argued that the fiscal benefits derived from Jewish lending were a poisoned gift that facilitated the damnation of Christian souls. Furthermore, the affair provided the Grand Conseil with the legal, theological ammunition to declare the 1360 Residency Charter null and void. The advisors to the Queen and the uncles utilized the Machault case to assert that the Jewish community had violated the implicit moral conditions of their residency by interfering with the religious uniformity of the realm. This shifted the burden of proof. The community was no longer required to prove its fiscal utility, but to prove its spiritual harmlessness, a standard that was impossible to meet within the millenarian atmosphere of the late 14th century. The Machault trial served as the definitive judicial pivot, transforming the Jewish status from a debate over tax farming into an urgent matter of inquisitorial defense. By the time the final edict was drafted in 1394, the legal precedent established by the Machault affair was cited as the primary moral justification for the permanent removal of the Jewish population, framing the expulsion as a necessary prophylactic measure to protect the sanctity of the baptismal font. The fiscal obsolescence of the Jewish community in the late 14th century was a byproduct of the maturation of the French state's internal revenue systems, which rendered the specialized sponge model of Jewish credit administratively redundant. By the 1390s, the Valois monarchy had successfully institutionalized a permanent taxation regime composed of the gabelle on salt and the aids on commodities, managed by a professionalized class of Christian tax farmers known as fermiers. This bureaucratic evolution allowed the Grand Conseil to extract wealth directly from the Christian Third Estate through systematic consumption levies, rather than relying on the volatile and politically hazardous mechanism of Jewish tallages. The Chambre des Comptes had developed sophisticated auditing techniques that utilized the Bureau des Finances to monitor provincial cash flows, creating a centralized fiscal apparatus that no longer required religiously isolated intermediaries to lubricate local credit markets. Simultaneously, the French crown secured access to superior international credit networks provided by the Italian banking houses, primarily from Lucca and Genoa. These Lombard financiers possessed systemic advantages over the localized Jewish lenders, including the ability to facilitate large-scale transfers of specie across European borders via bills of exchange. Unlike the Jewish servi camera, whose capital was often tied up in small-scale agricultural and artisanal debts, the Italians could provide the monarchy with massive, instantaneous loans secured against the royal customs and the wool trade. The professionalization of these Christian mercantile networks meant that the crown could service its military and diplomatic expenditures through integrated European markets, rather than through the extraction of devalued local currency from the Juveries. Consequently, the specialized financial role of the Jewish community, once an essential instrument of the Capetian state, was reduced to a surplus demographic that offered diminishing returns to the Valois treasury. The administrative shift was also reflected in the reorganization of the royal debt collection process. The Grand Conseil realized that the high political cost of defending Jewish lenders against populist rebellions, such as the Maillotin uprising, outweighed the fiscal yield of their interest-bearing contracts. The monarchy began to favor the contrat de rente, a form of long-term investment that allowed Christian burgesses to lend to the state in exchange for a fixed annual return. This transitioned the royal debt into the hands of the kingdom's own political elite, creating a symbiotic relationship between the crown and the rising merchant class. As Christian lenders became the primary underwriters of the royal administration, the Jewish community's traditional function as a fiscal lightning rod became a liability. The monarchy no longer needed a protected minority to deflect the unpopularity of credit, as the credit system itself was becoming a standardized feature of Christian civic life. Furthermore, the demographic contraction of the Jewish population following the recurrent plagues had significantly reduced their total taxable volume. The royal auditors noted that the administrative expense of maintaining the justices of the Jews and the specialized archy system was becoming disproportionate to the revenue generated. the Jewish community was trapped in a state of terminal economic marginalization. They were prohibited from entering the guilds and restricted from owning productive land. Yet their command of the credit market was being usurped by state-backed Christian firms. By 1394, the Jewish population had effectively been outcompeted by the very state-building project they had helped to finance. The decision to expel was therefore the final act of a rationalized fiscal policy. The Crown moved to liquidate a redundant asset, recognizing that the total confiscation of Jewish property would provide a final high-yield dividend without disrupting the modernized, Christian-led financial infrastructure of the realm. The formal issuance of the edict on September 17, 1394, represented the definitive legislative termination of Jewish habitation within the French royal domain, ending nearly 8 decades of conditional residency. The decree was promulgated during one of King Charles VI's brief, lucid intervals, or potentially signed by the Grand Conseil, acting in his name, specifically timed to coincide with the feast of St. Remigius. This liturgical synchronization was a deliberate symbolic maneuver to frame the political act of expulsion as a sacred purification of the Valois crown. Unlike the temporary suspensions of residency that characterized the earlier 14th century, the 1394 edict was drafted as an irreversible and perpetual statute, signaling that the monarchy had fundamentally abandoned the policy of utilizing the Jewish minority as a revolving fiscal instrument. The preamble of the decree articulated a narrative of religious necessity, asserting that the king had received grievous complaints from his Christian subjects regarding the social and spiritual friction caused by the Jewish presence. The legal text posited that the community had violated the terms of their previous charters, though the document refrained from detailing specific financial infractions, focusing instead on the abstract concept of communal disturbance. By framing the expulsion as a response to the cries of the people, the Royal Council provided a populism-inflected justification for the seizure of the community's residual assets. The edict effectively revoked all previous letters of privilege, rendering the legal standing of every Jewish individual within the realm null and void as of the moment of proclamation. The geographic scope of the mandate was absolute, encompassing the entirety of the French kingdom, including the recently consolidated southern provinces and the northern bailiwicks. The decree established a non-negotiable departure deadline of November 3, 1394, providing a window of less than 7 weeks for the total evacuation of the Jewish population. This timeline was administratively calculated to conclude before the onset of the winter logistical season, ensuring that the exodus did not interfere with the movements of the royal army or the collection of the autumn aids. Any Jew found within the kingdom after this date was declared an outlaw subject to capital punishment and the immediate forfeiture of their body and goods to the state. The 1394 edict also formalized the transition of all outstanding debt bonds into the hands of the royal treasury. While the document ostensibly permitted departing families to settle their private accounts, it mandated that all records of these transactions be submitted to the royal secretaries for final verification. This served as a bureaucratic filter, allowing the state to identify and sequester the most valuable credit instruments before they could be liquidated. The decree of September 17th thus functioned as the final audit of the Jewish royal relationship. It was a comprehensive act of state-building that utilized the language of theology to finalize a process of economic consolidation. By the close of the day, the legal framework that had permitted a non-Christian financial class to exist within France was dismantled, replaced by a mandate of absolute religious and social homogeneity that would remain in force for nearly 4 centuries. The theological rationale embedded in the 1394 edict utilized the specific doctrine of scandalum, or the spiritual stumbling block, to redefine the Jewish presence as an intolerable threat to the salvation of the French populace. The central claim that the Jewish minority disturbed the consciences of the faithful served as a formal legal mechanism to prioritize the suprema lex, the salvation of souls, over the secular fiscal utility that had defined the previous 8 decades of Valois policy. By the late 14th century, the theologians of the University of Paris, led by figures such as Jean Gerson, had successfully lobbied the Grand Conseil to adopt a model of sacred governance, where the physical health of the king and the spiritual health of the kingdom were viewed as inextricably linked. The edict asserted that the continued social and commercial interaction between Christians and Jews was a source of moral pollution that fundamentally obstructed the divine favor necessary to resolve the great Western Schism and the king's recurring infirmity. The judicial weight of the disturbed consciences argument rested on the canonical prohibition against contagio, the perceived spiritual infection that occurred when non-believers held any form of influence over the baptized. The edict framed Jewish moneylending not merely as a commercial transaction, but as a ritualized form of dominance that inverted the natural order of a Christian state. The Royal Council argued that by permitting Jews to hold the property of Christians as collateral, the monarchy had become an institutional accomplice to the sin of usury, thereby scandalizing the entire body politic. This shift moved the Jewish status from a matter of royal property to a matter of sacred hygiene. The document posited that the king's title of Rex Christianissimus, or Most Christian King, was compromised by the persistence of a religiously distinct minority that openly rejected the divinity of Christ while dwelling under royal protection. The theological advisors utilized the concept of infidelitas to bridge the gap between the Denis Michaud affair and the general population. They argued that the presence of organized Jewish life provided a living temptation for recent converts to relapse, suggesting that the sincerity of a Christian's faith was constantly under siege as long as the Jewish quarter remained active. This narrative transformed the Jewish community into an existential pathogen within the mystical body of France. The edict claimed that the cries and lamentations of the Christian people were a symptom of this spiritual distress, allowing the crown to present the expulsion as a benevolent response to a collective crisis of faith. By framing the removal as an act of mercy for the troubled hearts of the populace, the Grand Conseil successfully decoupled the monarchy from its historical role as the community's primary guarantor. Furthermore, the theological rationale served to silence the pragmatic objections of the trésorier and the mercantile class. The Grand Conseil asserted that the honor of God superseded all considerations of earthly profit, effectively declaring the Jewish tax base to be tainted wealth that could no longer be accepted by a purified crown. This ideological pivot allowed the monarchy to seize the community's assets under the guise of restitution for spiritual injury. The 1394 decree thus finalized the transition from a fiscal state to a confessional state. The Jew was no longer a servant to be managed, but a conscience disturber to be excised. This theological framework established a permanent barrier to any future return, as the edict defined the French royal domain as a consecrated space where the salvation of the faithful was legally incompatible with the presence of the infidel. The interval between the proclamation of September 17th and the terminal deadline of November 3rd, 1394, functioned as a period of intensive administrative liquidation, characterized by the systematic dismantling of the Jewish community's remaining economic presence in the French royal domain. This 7-week window was not a period of legal leniency, but a strictly monitored phase of asset transference, where the Valois state utilized its provincial bailiffs to ensure that the departing population remained solvent enough to settle their final royal obligations before crossing the frontier. The terms of departure dictated that every Jewish head of household was required to present a comprehensive inventory of their movable assets and outstanding commercial contracts to the local royal notary. This documentation served as the basis for the final assessment of the exit tallage, a terminal tax designed to extract the last reserves of liquid capital from the community as a prerequisite for the granting of safe conduct papers. The physical liquidation of personal estates occurred under conditions of extreme market distortion. While the 1394 edict ostensibly permitted the departing families to sell their household effects and mercantile stock, the temporal rigidity of the November deadline created a definitive buyer's market. In urban centers such as Paris and Orléans, Christian burgesses and municipal guilds recognized that the Jewish sellers lacked any legal recourse or the ability to delay transactions beyond the Feast of All Saints. Consequently, valuable assets, including fine textiles, artisanal tools, and professional libraries, were transferred at fractions of their appraised value. The royal administration supervised these transactions not to ensure equity, but to monitor the flow of currency. Any sale involving a significant sum was subject to a royal commission, effectively allowing the crown to profit from the distressed liquidation of its own subjects' lives. The management of outstanding debts during these weeks was governed by a specialized set of liquidation protocols issued by the Grand Conseil. Jewish lenders were authorized to collect the principal of their loans from Christian debtors, but the interest accumulated since the last charter extension was often declared forfeit to the crown as part of the restitution for spiritual injury. To facilitate this, the royal bailiffs utilized the Archy counterfoils to verify every claim. Lenders who could not settle their accounts before the November deadline were forced to assign their remaining bonds directly to the king's reservoirs. This administrative seizure ensured that the monarchy became the ultimate beneficiary of all uncollected Jewish credit, effectively converting the private wealth of the Kehalot into a permanent royal endowment that would be pursued by the state long after the physical population had vanished. Furthermore, the terms of departure imposed a totalizing ban on the export of specie and precious metals. Departing convoys were subjected to exhaustive searches at the royal frontier stations, where any gold florins, silver écus, or bullion exceeding a minimal subsistence allowance were summarily confiscated into the royal treasury. To circumvent the logistical impossibility of transporting large volumes of bulky commodities, many families were forced to accept letters of credit from Lombard or Italian bankers, which were redeemable only in foreign jurisdictions and carried high transactional fees. This ensured that the capital flight associated with the 1394 expulsion was minimized, as the bulk of the community's wealth remained geographically fixed within the French fiscal system. By the final week of October, the Jewish population had been reduced to a state of administrative transparency. Their property had been inventoried, their debts had been assigned, and their physical movement was now the final stage of a terminal bureaucratic operation. The terminal phase of the 1394 expulsion was characterized by the systematic physical seizure of the communal archive, the specialized document chests that served as the primary evidentiary repository for the kingdom's credit economy. Throughout October and early November, royal bailiffs and receivers, acting under direct warrants from the Chambre des Comptes, descended upon the synagogues and communal halls to secure these assets. The operation was designed to prevent the destruction or clandestine removal of chirographs, the indented debt contracts that were divided between lender and borrower. By seizing the royal half of these documents, the Valois state effectively nationalized the entire portfolio of outstanding Jewish credit. This was not a mere tax audit, but a total subrogation of rights, where the king legally stepped into the position of the primary creditor for thousands of individual debts scattered across the French provinces. The administrative procedure for the seizure utilized the triple lock security system that had traditionally governed the archive. These chests were typically secured with 3 distinct keys, held by a representative of the Jewish community, the local royal notary, and the bailiff. In the weeks preceding the final exodus, royal officials overrode these communal safeguards to perform a comprehensive census of the parchment counterfoils. Each bond was subjected to a rigorous verification process by royal scribes, who matched the Hebrew and Latin endorsements to ensure the validity of the claims. Debts that were found to be improperly registered or lacking the official royal seal were summarily annulled, while valid bonds were transferred to the inventory of the Trésor des Chartes. This process ensured that the monarchy possessed a granular map of the kingdom's private indebtedness, allowing the treasury to identify exactly which members of the Christian nobility and burgess class were financially vulnerable. The legal mechanism for this confiscation was the doctrine of dead hand forfeiture, which asserted that because the Jewish community's residency rights had expired, all their intangible assets reverted to the sovereign. This transition transformed the nature of the debt itself. While a Jewish lender might have been open to renegotiation or extensions, the royal receveurs operated with the full coercive power of the state. The Chambre des Comptes established specialized commissions to oversee the collection of these Jewish debts for years following the expulsion. Christian debtors who had hoped the removal of the Jewish population would result in the cancellation of their obligations found themselves instead facing royal tax collectors who utilized the prévôt's officers to enforce foreclosures and seizures of property to satisfy the king's new claims. Furthermore, the seizure of the arché allowed the crown to conduct a final, exhaustive audit of the Jewish community's liquid reserves. By cross-referencing the debt bonds with the exit tallages paid by departing families, royal auditors could identify financiers who had attempted to conceal assets. The physical chests, once emptied of their legal documents, were often repurposed for municipal storage or broken down for their valuable metal fittings. The documents themselves were transported to central repositories such as the Sainte-Chapelle or the Bastille, where they were organized into ledger books for the king's advocates. This bureaucratic absorption finalized the community's economic existence in France. Their wealth was no longer a circulating force in the markets, but had been converted into a static, state-managed endowment that provided the Valois monarchy with a consistent revenue stream throughout the early 15th century. By the time the final wagons reached the border, the arché, the physical heart of Jewish commercial life, remained behind as the property of a state that had successfully commodified their departure. The terminal liquidation of Jewish real estate in late 1394 represented a massive, uncompensated transfer of urban infrastructure that permanently altered the architectural and demographic landscape of the French royal domain. Unlike movable assets, which could be concealed or transported with difficulty, immovable property, comprising stone dwellings, commercial storefronts, and industrial facilities like dye works and tanneries, remained anchored within the municipal fabric, subject to the summary jurisdiction of the royal voyeurs and surveyors. The Edict of September 17th created a structural paradox. While it ostensibly granted departing families the right to sell their homes, the imposition of the November 3rd deadline ensured that these transactions occurred under conditions of total market paralysis. The sudden influx of hundreds of properties into highly localized urban quarters, such as the Rue des Juifs in Paris or the concentrated enclaves in Rouen and Lyon, resulted in an immediate saturation that drove valuations to a fraction of their prior assessment. The administrative mechanics of this distressed liquidation were overseen by royal commissioners who functioned as the primary auditors of these forced sales. Prospective Christian buyers, primarily neighboring burgesses and members of the rising merchant guilds, recognized that the Jewish sellers possessed zero bargaining power. Any sale that was not concluded by the Feast of All Saints would result in the automatic forfeiture of the property to the crown under the doctrine of escheat. Consequently, the purchase prices recorded in the contemporary notarial registers reflect a pittance model, where prime urban real estate was acquired for sums that barely covered the outstanding municipal ground rents. This was not merely an effect of private opportunism, but a structural feature of the Valois legal framework, which prioritized the rapid Christianization of the urban core over the preservation of the seller's equity. The disposal of communal and consecrated property followed an even more aggressive path of expropriation. Synagogues, study halls, and ritual baths were legally categorized as public nuisances whose existence was tied to the revoked residency charters. Rather than being sold on the open market, These structures were frequently donated by the crown to local parishes or religious orders in exchange for spiritual intercession for the king's health. The conversion of these buildings into chapels or administrative annexes served to physically erase the Jewish presence from the city's visual lexicon. Similarly, Jewish cemeteries, often located just outside the city walls, were seized, and their legal status as sacred ground was terminated. These plots were either converted into grazing land or sold to developers for the construction of new Christian suburbs, a process that involved the systematic removal and repurposing of headstones as building material for fortifications and municipal bridges. The fiscal yield from these real estate transactions was further diminished for the sellers by the imposition of conveyance taxes and verification fees levied by the Chambre des Comptes. Even when a sale was successfully brokered for a nominal sum, a significant portion of the proceeds was sequestered by royal receivers to satisfy perceived spiritual damages or to pay for the safe conduct papers of the departing family. This ensured that the capital derived from the liquidation did not exit the kingdom but remained in the hands of the Christian elite or the royal treasury. By the arrival of the November deadline, the Juveries had been effectively gutted of their value. The transfer of these properties finalized the socio-economic exclusion of the Jewish minority, as the physical spaces they had occupied for generations were integrated into the permanent patrimony of the Christian Third Estate, leaving the exiles with neither a home to return to nor the capital to establish a new existence abroad. The distribution of royal letters of safe conduct, or lettres de sauf-conduit, functioned as the final logistical instrument for the orderly evacuation of the Jewish population, serving as a specialized permit that transformed the act of exile into a state-managed operation. These documents were not granted as a humanitarian gesture, but were issued as a final commercial product of the Valois administration, sold to departing families at rates determined by their remaining liquid assets. The safe conduct served a dual administrative purpose. It provided the bearer with a temporary legal immunity from the summary jurisdiction of local feudal lords and municipal magistrates, while simultaneously acting as a receipt for the exit taxes and tallages previously collected by the royal receivers. By requiring every individual to carry a validated royal seal to reach the frontier, the Grand Conseil ensured that no person could depart the realm without first undergoing a final audit by the bailli or seneschal. The primary feature of the 1394 safe conduct was the provision of a garde du corps, a specialized military escort composed of royal sergeants-at-arms or mounted archers. This escort was a mandatory service for which the exiles were forced to pay a protection fee that far exceeded the actual cost of the garrison. The presence of these royal guards was essential to prevent capital leakage, the unauthorized seizure of Jewish goods by the provincial nobility or rural brigands before they could be processed at the border. In the legal framework of late 14th century France, a departing Jew without a royal escort was technically subject to the droit d'aubaine, a custom that allowed a local lord to confiscate the property of any foreigner dying or traveling through his territory. The royal safe conduct effectively overrode these local feudal rights, asserting the king's ownership of the exiles until they physically crossed the jurisdictional boundaries of the royal domain. Logistically, the safe conducts dictated the specific routes of exodus, funneling the population toward designated border crossings such as the bridge at Pont Saint-Esprit for those heading toward Provence, or the eastern passes into the Holy Roman Empire. This concentration of movement allowed the royal administration to maintain a high level of surveillance over the departing wealth. At each provincial border, the letters were inspected and cross-referenced with the inventories held by the royal notaries. If a family's physical property exceeded the amount declared in their safe conduct, the surplus was summarily sequestered as contraband of the crown. This ensured that the transition was a unidirectional transfer of wealth, where the monarchy utilized its military apparatus to harvest the final remnants of the community's domestic holdings. The safe conducts also functioned as a tool for cleansing the royal records. Upon reaching the final frontier station, the guards were required to witness the physical departure of the group and then return the original letters to the local bailliage to be canceled. This created a definitive bureaucratic endpoint. Once a safe conduct was marked as returned, the individual was legally erased from the royal tax rolls and the survey camera registry. The physical return of the royal guards to their garrisons, often carrying the final confiscated portions of the exiles' baggage, signaled the completion of the state's terminal audit. Through this system of escorted departure, the Valois monarchy achieved a totalizing administrative success. It maintained order during a mass migration, prevented local lords from intercepting royal revenue, and ensured that the final exit of the Jewish population was as fiscally productive as their residence had been. The physical departure of the Jewish population by the winter of 1394 resulted in a profound structural paralysis within the urban microeconomies of Paris, Rouen, and Lyon, as the abandonment of the Giveries dismantled the kingdom's most accessible networks of small-scale credit. This empty quarter phenomenon was not merely a residential vacancy, but the terminal failure of a specialized financial infrastructure that had provided the liquidity necessary for daily artisanal and mercantile operations. In Paris, the cessation of activity in the enclaves of the Ile de la Cité and the Saint-Magloire district removed the primary source of pawnbroking and short-term lending for the city's lower middle class. While the Italian bankers in the Lombard quarters continued to manage royal and high-level commercial debt, they lacked the decentralized apparatus required to service the pledge economy of the local craft guilds, who relied on Jewish lenders to bridge the gap between production and sale. In Rouen, the Rue aux Juifs underwent a rapid transition from a vibrant commercial artery to a sequestered administrative zone. The removal of the Jewish financial agents who had traditionally facilitated the transit of English wool and Flemish textiles created a credit vacuum that stalled the city's manufacturing sector. Local Christian lenders, fearing the strictures of canon law regarding usury and lacking the royal protection that had shielded Jewish interest rates, proved unable to absorb the volume of business formerly managed by the exiles. This structural gap forced many Parisian and Rouennais artisans into a state of chronic insolvency, as they no longer possessed an institution willing to accept household goods or tools as collateral for the silver coinage required to pay royal aids and gabels. In Lyon, a city that functioned as a pivot for Mediterranean trade, the abandonment of the Jewish quarter disrupted the specialized brokerage services that had coordinated the exchange of foreign bullion. The structural vacuum was further exacerbated by the Crown's decision to maintain the Juveries as distinct, sequestered properties under the management of royal reservoirs, rather than integrating them immediately into the municipal housing stock. This created dead zones within the city walls where the physical buildings remained intact, but the economic life they housed had been surgically extracted. The Chambre des Comptes noted a significant decline in the velocity of local currency circulation in these districts, as the small denomination coins that Jewish financiers had kept in constant motion were now hoarded or exported to settle the final installments of the royal debt. The long-term impact of these empty quarters was a localized deflationary cycle that affected the urban poor more severely than the royal treasury. The removal of the Jewish community eliminated the lender of last resort for the peasantry and urban laborers, pushing them toward unlicensed and more predatory Christian underground lenders who operated without the regulatory oversight of the royal archy. The Valois state's achieved goal of religious homogeneity thus came at the price of a more fragile internal economy. The physical silence of the formerly dense and active Jewish quarters in 1395 stood as a demographic triumph for the court of Isabeau of Bavaria. But it simultaneously signaled the permanent loss of a flexible financial class that had provided French urban centers with a unique degree of economic resilience during the most volatile decades of the 14th century. The architectural transition of the 1394 expulsion was defined by the systematic Christianization of Jewish communal assets, a process that converted the physical remnants of the Kehilot into permanent monuments of the Valois confessional state. Upon the departure of the final exiles in November, the Grand Conseil issued a series of lettres de don, or letters of gift, which bypassed the standard liquidation markets to transfer synagogues, academies, and ritual baths directly to the ecclesiastical hierarchy and favored religious orders. This redistribution was managed as a form of liturgical reparations, where the property of the servants of the chamber was repurposed to expand the parish infrastructure of Paris and the provincial capitals. The legal theory underpinning this transfer was the reconciliatio, a canonical procedure used to purge a structure of its infidel associations and consecrate it for the celebration of the Mass. The conversion of the Great Synagogue of Paris and other prominent urban houses of prayer followed a rigid protocol of architectural sanitization. Masonry teams were commissioned by the new ecclesiastical owners to erase Hebrew epigraphy from the lintels and interior walls, replacing them with Latin inscriptions and the heraldic devices of the royal family or the donating bishop. The interior layout was fundamentally reoriented. The bima, or central reading platform, was dismantled to provide an unobstructed view of the eastern wall, where a high altar was typically installed to facilitate the Roman rite. These spaces were frequently dedicated to Saint Denis or Saint Remigius, reinforcing the link between the expulsion and the spiritual health of the Valois dynasty. The transformation of a synagogue into a chapel served as a visual, triumph of the faith, providing the urban populace with a permanent, physical reminder of the Jewish community's totalized exclusion. The mendicant orders, particularly the Franciscans and Augustinians who had provided the theological justification for the 1394 edict, were the primary beneficiaries of this spatial conversion. In several instances, entire clusters of Jewish dwellings adjacent to the former synagogues were granted to these orders to be converted into cloisters or student dormitories for the University of Paris. The Batei Midrash, or houses of study, which had formerly housed rabbinic manuscripts and legal academies, were repurposed as parish archives or notarial offices. This ensured that the intellectual centers of the Jewish community were physically absorbed into the administrative machinery of the church. The mikvaot, or ritual baths, were often filled in or converted into mundane storage cellars, as their function was deemed incompatible with the new sacred character of the site. Furthermore, the conversion of space extended to the symbolic remapping of urban geography. The former Jewish quarters were often renamed to reflect their new Christian identity, with streets formerly known as the Rue des Juifs being rededicated to various saints or the Virgin Mary. This toponymic erasure was essential for the Crown to signal that the 1394 expulsion was not a temporary suspension of residency, but a permanent demographic termination. By integrating these repurposed buildings into the annual cycle of processions and liturgical feasts, the Church and State effectively anchored the memory of the expulsion into the daily life of the Christian burgesses. The structural vacuum left by the exiles was thus filled not with new commerce, but with a densified network of chapels and shrines that celebrated the homogeneity of the realm. By 1395, the architectural evidence of a Jewish presence in France had been largely subsumed into the Gothic fabric of the Gallican Church, leaving only the ghosts of the former Juveries embedded in the foundations of the new royal chapels. The physical passage of the Jewish population across the frontiers of the royal domain in November 1394 inaugurated a period of official absence that would remain the standing law of France for nearly 4 centuries. This final exodus was characterized by a fragmentation of the community into 3 primary geographic directions, determined by the surviving mercantile connections and the varying degrees of political autonomy in neighboring territories. To the east, many families sought refuge within the Holy Roman Empire, specifically in the semi-autonomous imperial cities of the Rhineland and the Palatinate. Unlike the centralized Valois state, the empire's decentralized structure allowed for localized residency agreements with bishops and municipal councils, although these were often as precarious as the French charters. The exiles integrated into the existing Ashkenazi networks of Alsace and the Lorraine, regions that were not yet under the French crown, effectively moving the center of northern Jewish life outside the reach of the Parisian administration. In the south, the exodus was funneled toward the Kingdom of Aragon and the independent county of Provence. While the 1394 decree was absolute for the French royal domain, the county of Provence remained under the sovereignty of the House of Anjou, operating as a distinct legal entity until its incorporation in 1481. This allowed a significant number of exiles to find temporary sanctuary in cities like Arles and Marseille. where they utilized their remaining capital to facilitate Mediterranean trade. However, those who crossed the Pyrenees into Aragon entered a landscape already destabilized by the massacres of 1391. These refugees became part of a demographic pressure that would eventually culminate in the Spanish expulsion of 1492, as the Iberian monarchies began to emulate the Valois model of religious homogeneity. Another cluster of exiles migrated to the Comtat Venaissin, the papal territory surrounding Avignon, where the Pope's Jews existed under a specialized protective status that bypassed the French royal edicts. The administrative legacy of the 1394 expulsion was the total removal of the Jewish question from the French legislative record. From the departure of the final exiles until the French Revolution, no Jewish individual could legally reside in France under their own name or practice their faith. The Edict of September 17th remained the governing statute of the realm, never formally rescinded by the Valois or Bourbon dynasties. While the 16th century saw the arrival of new Christians from Portugal, Sephardic Jews fleeing the Inquisition under the guise of being Catholic, their legal status in France was founded on a deliberate ambiguity. They were permitted to reside as Portuguese merchants rather than as Jews, and it was not until the letters patent of 1723 that their true religious identity was even partially acknowledged by the state. The 400-year cleansing of the French heartland facilitated the total consolidation of the Gallican Church's cultural and social monopoly. By removing the only non-Christian minority with a distinct legal status, the monarchy achieved a degree of internal uniformity that became a hallmark of French absolutism. The professionalized credit systems that replaced Jewish lending were entirely integrated into the Christian Third Estate, ensuring that the financial machinery of the state was no longer vulnerable to the populist religious volatility of the 14th century. The 1394 expulsion thus served as the final act of a state-building project that prioritized institutional homogeneity over the flexible fiscal utility of the past. When the National Assembly eventually granted Jewish citizenship in 1791, they were not reforming a living community, but were legally resurrecting a demographic that the 1394 decree had sought to erase from the French memory forever.